You know, we take time from time to time to get some additional perspectives on the presidential race in this case. And joining us this morning to help us with that is John Clark, chair of the WMU Political Science Department. He's with us for a few minutes now. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Richard.
Well, thanks for the time today.
Not a problem. Beautiful day, at least in Kalamazoo.
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty nice here, too. So let's just start with a broad look at things right now and the way things stand between Clinton and Trump and a few others.
Sure.
What are your impressions today of what's happening?
Well, you know, this is a presidential election campaign like I've never seen before. I think that we can find kind of bits and pieces of similarities with different campaigns, but not usually at the presidential level. It's one of these races where at some point I suspect even folks like you and I are going to get burned out. But at this point, you know, you almost got to get up in the morning and find out what happened last night, because it seems like almost every day there's something new going on. Not always something good new, but always something new.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, at some point I think we'll all hit the wall, maybe at different points in time, and say, I just can't take any of this any longer.
Right.
But this is really a fascinating campaign. And, you know, for folks like me, political scientists that study things like elections, I think after this election, we're going to have to kind of sit down and say, okay, this is how we thought the world worked. Maybe we should reconsider some of those things.
Boy, that could be a whole show in and of itself, I suppose.
I suspect so. But you have to wait till after the election because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. What about that burnout factor? Is that going to favor one candidate over another in some way?
You know, my sense of things is that really is, in part, what the Trump campaign is counting on. There are different approaches to how you run a presidential election campaign. And if you think back to 2004, the Bush campaign, as George W. Bush was running for re-election, the Bush campaign, under a strategy designed by Karl Rove, said, we are going to drive down turnout in this election. We are going to get our base to show up, and we're going to do what we can to keep their base from showing up. And if we do that, we'll win. The country's fairly evenly divided, and so all we have to do is you know, turn out our base. That kind of a base election strategy worked for the Republicans in 2004. It didn't work for them in 2008 or 2012 because the Obama campaign in both of those elections was able to expand the electorate, go beyond just their Democratic base and bring in new people into the electorate. If you remember in 2012, there were Republican operatives on Election Day who said, we got this in the bag. They didn't think that Obama's campaign was going to be able to bring those folks back to the polls. They didn't think he was going to be able to reassemble his 2008 election coalition. And if he hadn't been able to, then Mitt Romney would be president and Barack Obama would not have been reelected. So my sense is that the Trump strategy, to the extent that there's a coherent strategy, which in itself is not completely clear, but to the extent to which there is, they want to make this a negative election, a negative campaign. They want to drive up Hillary Clinton's negatives. Their negatives are already high. But if they can get their Republican base to show up, then they have the best chance of winning. And the way that happens is that an awful lot of people do get burned out on the election process, do decide to stay home on Election Day. And the ones that show up, the expectation is, will be more likely to vote for the Republican candidate.
The impression is, as you described the Obama factor, if you will, that the Clinton factor this time around doesn't have that same kind of motivating of the base. But that's just me looking from the outside. Do you see it that way?
No, I think that's exactly right. That you know, even though she's the first major party nominee to be a woman, she has the chance to be the first woman president. That luster has sort of worn off over the last 8 years. Even though we haven't had a female president, that's not as much of a novelty as it might have been at an earlier point in time. And, of course, she enters this campaign with considerably high negatives herself. And as a result, you know, it's hard to generate that kind of enthusiasm to mobilize people that haven't been mobilized before. they've been able to do that to some extent, but at this point, it seems that it's much more limited, certainly, than President Obama was able to do in either of his campaigns.
So these people who have that giant meteor bumper sticker on their car that says, I don't know who I'm voting for, just whatever. How is that going to affect things? Do you see them funneling to a third-party candidate or just not going, both? What do you see there?
Well, I think there'll be a little bit of both. Certainly in this election campaign, there are a couple of minor party candidates that have gotten at least a little bit of attention, and they're on the ballot in every state or almost every state, and so people will have the opportunity to vote for somebody else. I think that's going to vary in part depending on the competitiveness of the state. Doesn't happen very often, but we can point to circumstances and elections, individual elections, where a minor party candidate has played a spoiler. And for me, probably the best example of that is in Florida in 2000, where, after the long extended recount, George W. Bush beat Al Gore by less than 1,000 votes. Mm-hmm. And Ralph Nader picked up a fairly small percentage of the vote, but if those Nader votes hadn't voted for him, he was the Green Party nominee, if they hadn't voted for him, then in all likelihood they would have voted for Al Gore. Certainly less likely that they would have voted for George W. Bush. Maybe some of them wouldn't have voted at all. But under those circumstances, that minor party candidate can play a spoiler. I think that there are a number of folks in more competitive states who would look at that situation and say, boy, I'm not real fond of either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, but my worst fear would be that, this one gets elected.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I'm going to hold my nose and vote for the other one.
Right.
In states that are not competitive, it doesn't matter. And so a protest vote is only that. It's only a protest vote. And so, while I expect those minor party candidates to do somewhat better in this election cycle than in some other years, I don't think it's going to be as big a factor in places like Michigan, as long as Michigan stays competitive. On the other hand, in states like Michigan, it doesn't take very many of those votes to potentially swing the election one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the vote to oppose the other candidate. It seemed as though a somewhat of a no-brainer that the Bernie supporters would say, okay, the man himself has said, vote for Hillary, we better go do that. My sense is that they're not falling in line.
Well, I think there are a lot of differences. I suspect that in places like Michigan, for the most part, Sanders supporters in the primary are now, for the most part, backing Hillary Clinton in the presidential election. But in other places, that's not the case, and that, I certainly wouldn't say that's true of every Sanders supporter. And so, in some ways, it depends on what motivated them to support Bernie Sanders. If they're interested in a set of policies, and they look at the two nominees and say, her policies are clearly closer to Sanders than his policies, meaning Trump's policies are, then they're likely to get on the Hillary bandwagon. On the other hand, if they were drawn to Sanders because here's a Democratic socialist who says the whole thing is rigged and you can't trust anybody, then they might still think that. And under those circumstances, I suspect that's a relatively small number of Sanders supporters, but there's no telling who they might vote for or whether they would vote at all.
Mm-hmm. We're talking with John Clark. He's the chair of the Western Michigan University Political Science Department. We'll come back in a minute and talk about this change in personnel at the Trump campaign and what might have motivated that and what we've seen so far as having been the major difference in the campaign since. We'll discuss that coming up in just a moment. We're talking with John Clark, chair of the WMU Poli-Sci Department, about the presidential race. And, well, the Trump campaign decided to make some changes in terms of the masterminds at the helm there recently. Has there been any effect to that you can see, John, and what might have motivated it?
Well, in some ways, it's a little too early to see what the impact is. But the purpose of the campaign is to get the candidate elected. And when the Trump folks brought on Paul Manafort, the former campaign chair, they needed somebody who understood how to run the Republican convention, the nominating convention itself. And so Manafort was an old hand at that, a lot of experience. brought him in. And while you could quibble about whether or not the convention itself was effective, Manafort certainly did a good job of stabilizing the support of Trump delegates and making sure that his candidate got the nomination.
Mm-hmm.
When the campaign staff becomes the news story, though, then you run into problem. And that's been the case so far with two of Trump's campaign chairs. They start to become the news story, and it takes away from the candidate's effectiveness, because now, rather than the campaign talking about why the candidate should be elected, they're talking about why they should keep their jobs. I think that the change, in part, at the top of the campaign, sort of trading out Paul Manafort for two new people, Kellyanne Conway as the campaign manager, Steve Bannon as the campaign CEO. In some ways, it almost presents kind of a mixed signal. Conway is good with the media. She's a pollster by trade, but she's been involved in campaigns for a long time. She's been on television a lot, and as a campaign spokesperson, and as that part of her role as campaign manager, she can try and smooth over a lot of the rough edges of the things that Donald Trump says and tweets. And so far, that's been her primary role, at least her primary visible role. But she's, I think, designed to soften the edges in the Trump candidacy. Steve Bannon has sort of the opposite reputation. And while she may be seen, Kellyanne Conway may be seen as somebody who can soften the edges, Steve Bannon has, demonstrated in his previous career that he's not much into soft edges. And so, it will be interesting as we move closer to the election to see how that campaign as an organization is able to shape their candidate's image in a way that's going to help him to win the election. We've seen, again, from her, this idea of softening, potentially appealing to suburban voters that are more likely to vote for Republicans, particularly, married white women that have been a key part of the Republican constituency for the last several election cycles, even though we've seen a gender gap with women more likely to support Democratic candidates. There's this block of voters that have been Republican voters in recent elections, and Trump has not been able to appeal to them at all. Maybe in part that's what Conway is there to try to do. But it will be interesting to see whether we see the toned-down, semi-disciplined Donald Trump or the bombastic, completely undisciplined Donald Trump. And in some ways, it depends on whether we watch the speeches or watch the Twitter feed.
Mm-hmm. So if you had a nugget of advice for both candidates, something you think they should or should not be doing right now, what would it be?
Well, I think for both of them, their weaknesses are very much evident. For Trump, on the one hand, this persona that he's created first on reality TV and now in the campaign, the bombastic Donald Trump certainly has some appeal to some voters. But at the same time, it's not at all clear that that's going to resonate with people who aren't automatically drawn to it. And is there a way that he can expand his appeal beyond his core supporters? Again, I think that's where Kellyanne Conway is at least trying to do that. His recent appeals to African-American voters, Hispanic voters, perhaps softening his immigration stance, although the campaign says that's not what he's doing. Those aren't designed to motivate people who are going to vote for him. Those are designed to appeal to people who say, this guy is off the reservation. I'm not sure I can support him. Oh, well, maybe he's not quite so bad, right? Mm-hmm. For Hillary Clinton, her negatives are based around the question of her truthfulness, the question of her ethics. Those are the kinds of things that she needs to be able to shore up between now and Election Day. And, we haven't seen a lot of advertising from the Trump campaign. Once they do hit the airwaves hard and heavy, that's what they're going to be going after. And so she's got to find ways to connect with people. She's not natural at that at all. She said so herself. That's going to be the real challenge. In some ways, you can think of a number of campaigns that have gone this way, not necessarily national campaigns, but where the candidates have had a lot of negatives. The Republican gubernatorial election that eventually set up Arnold Schwarzenegger's election as governor in a special election after a recall. The 1991 Louisiana gubernatorial election, I'm sure you remember that one, Richard. Edwin Edwards, who at that point had been tried on corruption charges but not convicted, running for governor against David Duke, the former Klan leader. The famous bumper sticker from that was one of my all-time favorites, "Vote for the crook, it's important." But these are elections where candidates have very high negatives. This election seems like that, and so the candidates, each of them, has to find ways, again, to motivate that base and try and reduce the effect of the negative ads that we're going to see from now until Election Day.
All right. Well, we appreciate the perspective. Thank you. John Clark, chair of the WMU Political Science Department on WBCK.